In the United States, student loans are both a pathway to higher education and a source of long-term financial burden for millions. With rising tuition costs, stagnant wages, and a rapidly shifting economy, the student loan system has come under increased scrutiny. Today, discussions about debt forgiveness, inflation, and dollar devaluation have converged into a larger question. How do student loans fit into the broader economic landscape, and what are the implications for both borrowers and the U.S. economy? While many view rising wages and calls for debt forgiveness as positive changes, the truth is far more complicated. As we explored in our previous analysis, the devaluation of the U.S. dollar, a result of inflationary pressures and an overinflated M2 money supply, makes it harder for borrowers to repay their loans. At the same time, the role that student loan repayments play in government finances and the broader economic consequences of canceling debt must be fully understood to grasp the intricate balance at play. How student loans work and why they matter. The student loan system in the U.S. has two primary components: federal loans and private loans. Federal loans, which are by far the most common, are issued by the U.S. government and come with relatively low fixed interest rates and flexible repayment terms. Students borrow money to cover their tuition and living expenses, and they begin repaying those loans after graduation, often with a grace period. Borrowers can choose from a variety of repayment plans, including income-driven options that allow them to adjust payments based on their earnings. The fundamental purpose of student loans is to make education accessible, but the system is far from perfect. As of 2024, student loan debt in the U.S. exceeds $1.7 trillion, with the average borrower owing more than $37,000. While many see student loans as a necessary investment in future earnings, the rising cost of higher education, coupled with wage stagnation, has made it increasingly difficult for borrowers to pay down their debt. This challenge is now exacerbated by broader economic forces, particularly the devaluation of the dollar, which weakens borrowers' ability to repay loans effectively, regardless of how much they may earn over time. The impact of dollar devaluation on repaying student loans. One of the most pressing issues facing student loan borrowers today is how the devaluation of the U.S. dollar is impacting their ability to repay debt. As inflation rises and the dollar weakens, borrowers find themselves with less purchasing power. Each dollar repaid is worth less in real terms, meaning it takes more income to service the same amount of debt. This phenomenon is not just theoretical, it's playing out in real time across the economy. In essence, inflation means that borrowers are paying more for everyday essentials like housing, groceries, and healthcare. Even if wages increase, they often don't keep pace with inflation, leaving borrowers stretched thin. The end result is that while the nominal amount of debt remains unchanged, the real value of the payments made by borrowers has effectively decreased. Take, for example, a borrower who owes $37,000 in student loans. Even with steady employment and modest wage increases, rising costs erode the borrower's disposable income, making it harder to allocate funds toward loan payments. Inflation, fueled by an overextended M2 money supply, means that borrowers are spending more of their income on necessities, leaving less room to pay down debt. As a result, the devaluation of the dollar compounds the financial strain of student loans, creating a debt burden that feels heavier even as wages inch upward. What happens to student loan payments, government revenue and use? When borrowers make payments on their federal student loans, the money doesn't simply disappear. In fact, these payments are a source of revenue for the government. But how is this money used? And what does it mean for the broader economy? Interest payments on federal student loans generate significant income for the U.S. government. While a portion of the revenue is used to cover administrative costs associated with running the federal student loan program, the excess revenue often contributes to the federal budget. In theory, the program is designed to be self-sustaining, with payments from borrowers funding the loans for future students. The Federal Student Aid Office, which administers the program, reinvests a portion of the payments into new loans, ensuring the continuity of the system. However, this flow of funds goes beyond simply covering future loans. In practice, student loan repayments also contribute to the larger federal budget, helping to fund various programs and services. This means that any disruption in the flow of payments, such as widespread debt cancellation, could have significant implications for the federal budget. The loss of future revenue from student loan repayments would create a gap that the government would need to fill, likely through borrowing or increased taxes. In short, student loan payments are not just a financial transaction between borrower and lender, they are a critical part of the government's broader financial apparatus. What debt cancellation really means: the economic impact. The concept of student loan debt cancellation has gained significant traction in recent years, with many arguing that it would provide much-needed relief to borrowers struggling to make ends meet. But what does canceling student debt actually entail, and how does it affect the economy as a whole? When the government cancels student loans, it is essentially writing off the remaining balances as a loss. For borrowers, this means they are no longer required to make payments on the canceled portion of their debt. But for the government, this represents a significant forfeiture of future revenue. The funds that would have been repaid, both in principal and interest, are now wiped off the books. This lost revenue doesn't just disappear, it must be accounted for. In most cases, the government would absorb the cost of debt cancellation by increasing the federal deficit. This could be done through the issuance of government bonds or by raising taxes to cover the shortfall. Either way, the cost of debt cancellation would ultimately be borne by taxpayers or through increased borrowing, which contributes to the overall national debt. But the impact of debt cancellation doesn't stop there. By eliminating student loan payments, the government would inject a significant amount of liquidity into the economy. Borrowers who are no longer required to make monthly payments would have more disposable income to spend on goods and services. In theory, this could provide a short-term boost to consumer spending, stimulating the economy. However, this sudden influx of spending could also contribute to inflation. With more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, prices could rise even further, exacerbating the inflationary pressures that are already straining the economy. Moreover, by canceling debt, the government would effectively be increasing the M2 money supply, the total amount of money in circulation. This increase in liquidity, coupled with rising inflation, would further devalue the dollar, making it harder for consumers to afford everyday expenses. In this way, debt cancellation becomes a double-edged sword. While it may provide relief to borrowers in the short term, it could also fuel long-term inflation and contribute to further devaluation of the dollar, undermining the very economic stability it seeks to create. The big picture: student loans, inflation, and a weakening dollar. The relationship between student loans, inflation, and dollar devaluation is complex, but it is essential to understanding the broader economic landscape. Rising inflation, driven by an overinflated M2 money supply, is making it harder for borrowers to repay their loans as their dollars buy less. The government's use of student loan payments helps to fund federal programs and manage the budget, but widespread debt cancellation would disrupt this revenue stream, adding to the federal deficit and potentially fueling further inflation. Debt cancellation may provide a short-term solution for borrowers, but it does not address the underlying economic forces that are driving inflation and dollar devaluation. In fact, by increasing liquidity and reducing government revenue, it may contribute to the very problems it seeks to solve. As discussions around student loan forgiveness continue, it's important to consider the broader economic implications and the trade-offs involved. In future discussions, we'll explore how these economic dynamics play out in other areas of personal finance. But for now, the reality is clear. The student loan system, dollar devaluation, and inflation are deeply intertwined, and solving one problem often exacerbates another.